Awesome. Cool. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the San Diego Marketo group. Today is January 18th, 2022, which is wild, but I want to thank everybody for their time and for joining for today's mug. To do some quick introductions before we get started, my name is Keith Nyberg. I am a senior MOPS consultant at Atumos, and I am delighted to be joined by my new San Diego co-leader of the Marketo user group, Genesis. Genesis, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, everyone. My name is Genesis Velarde. I am the Global Marketing Operations Manager for Telium, and I'm super excited to be here and co-host this San Diego user mug today, 1st of January, 2022.
Awesome. Yeah. We're going to be working together on a lot of different things, but just to cover an agenda for today and what we're going to hope to cover in this quick 1-hour mug meeting. We're going to run through the mug housekeeping slides, which we always do at the start of every mug. I was going to do attendee introductions, but we've got enough people here today and the time is short, so I think that we'll probably just skip this for today. But I did want to say thank you to everybody for attending. After we do the housekeeping slides, we're going to run through a featured presentation that I am going to present on lead source tracking and UTM capture, which is probably the draw for why everybody wanted to attend this meeting. I always love talking about some candidates who are looking for jobs and open opportunities that people on the call may have. So if anybody's job hunting or looking for an open op, there'll be a time for us to quickly run through and discuss some of those things. I always love talking about tech stack too. There's tools that we all get to use in the industry outside of Marketo Engage, and it's fun to chit chat about those. So we'll have a brief discussion on that, things people have been playing with or like, and all these last topics are kind of time pending for how we move. I am also getting a notification that my internet is semi-unstable, even though I'm Etherneted. So if anybody's having issues, please don't hesitate to ping me in the chat and let me know. Finally, we're going to wrap things up with open discussion and networking, again, all time dependent. I want to remind everybody before I pass this off to Genesis to do the housekeeping slides that I love these meetings to be really informal. You guys are all here as participants. This isn't like a skill exchange or some other Adobe event where we're just going to present and you guys are going to be silent. So don't even feel like you need to sit in the chat to ask questions. You're more than welcome to if you don't want to speak up, but you're all more than welcome to toggle off mute, chat. Videos are obviously optional, but we really want to make this a collaborative discussion and group. So really appreciate everybody's participation as we proceed. But with that, I'm going to hand it off to Genesis to run through some of the housekeeping. So Genesis, you want to get things going here for us?
Sure, yeah. So before we get into the meat of everything, let's go over some of these housekeeping items. The first thing that we want to remind everyone is about our code of conduct, and this is just to make sure that our mug meetups stay user focused and is a place for us to learn, network, and problem solve. So we ask that there is no self-promotion or pitching of any kind. Please don't contact people outside of the user group without their consent. And if someone in the user group does share a use case, please don't share that information without their consent either. And that being said, shameless plug here, please stay connected to our Marketo user group and subscribe to our San Diego mug chapter. If you haven't already, check out the link on this page over here. Stay connected. Excuse me. If you haven't already, click on the link. Use your Marketo Engage email to set up an account and search for the San Diego chapter, and then you can sign up and join and subscribe today. And once you do join, you'll be able to learn about so many different things and upcoming opportunities and events to participate in, such as the upcoming Experience Makers, the Skill Exchange, featuring our very own Keith Nyberg as a speaker. This is a free event. It's digital. It's going to be a great opportunity to learn more about the Marketo platform, especially if you're just getting started with it, or if you want to dive into more advanced topics. This is also a chance for you to speak to the speakers live and ask your questions. It's going to be 3 hours. It takes place on Tuesday, February 8th at 9 a.m. We'll share the link out for more information in case you want to register. All good things coming. In terms of other upcoming events in January, keep an eye out for other upcoming mug events and the topics they'll be covering. And it looks like we have 2 more events for the month of January, one for Seattle and one for Japan. And then speaking of other things to get excited about, there are 2 different exams that you can choose from to receive your Marketo Engage business practitioner credential. One is the E552, and this one doesn't really require a lot of experience with Marketo's advanced features. And the newest one is the E554, and this was developed by Marketo champions with the end user in mind. It's designed for like partners and consultants who have a broad operational experience using the Marketo platform. And once again, we can share a link out later on for more information on those 2 exams and the study guides as well. So that is it for housekeeping items. Keith, I can turn it back over to you now. You can drive.
Thank you so much, Genesis. I appreciate that. Before we get going, does anybody have any questions on the code of conduct or any of the stuff that we presented here in the housekeeping slides that we can address? Silence is golden. Duct tape is silver. We shall proceed. If you have questions.
Yeah. So
Good.
the second new certification, the E554, that is the equivalent for to solutions architect, right?
It is the precursor for the Solutions Architect exam, which is coming out later this year, I believe. I don't know if it's been released yet, but this is essentially the equivalent of the legacy Marketo Certified Expert exam. Right now, both exams are still available, and that's because the new exam is kind of in beta mode, as I understand it. So you can take either of these tests. They will both give you your MCE, but that is different than the Marketo Solutions Architect exam that should be available later this year for the Solutions Architect program.
Okay, thank you.
That's a really great question, though. Thank you for asking. Awesome. If there's no other questions, I think we're going to get going. But for everybody on the call, if you're not certified, get certified. It's a great resume builder, great thing to have on your LinkedIn, and would highly encourage everybody to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to take over and start to go through the featured presentation for today, which is on lead source and UTM capture. I know that I said this at the beginning of the call, but this is an interactive meeting, right? This is a mug. Normally we used to do these in person. We'd raise hands. We'd talk all the time. There will be a section for questions at the end of this, but if you ever have a question on something that I'm presenting right now, I'll either let you know that I'm going to address it later on, or we can answer the question real time if it's relevant. But really do want to keep this informal, have some fun, keep this community oriented. So feel free to jump in at any time and let me know if you have questions or want to talk through things. So for the topics that we're going to cover today specific to lead source and UTM capture, which is a very broad category, we're going to talk about what is lead source. We're going to talk about what are UTMs. We're going to talk about how our channel and offer different, which is a really fun conversation I always love to have. We're going to talk about how UTMs can be captured. We're going to talk about what fields I need to capture a lead source in an instance. We'll talk about how I can use UTMs to set lead source values in Marketo. We'll talk about the difference between lead source and multi-touch attribution, because they really aren't the same. We'll also talk about what are the methods best are used to capture data that informs channels used to engage with offers, right? And then we'll talk about how to report on all of this stuff and ways that you can benefit from capturing lead source and UTMs in your instance. So diving right in, what is lead source? According to James Hauser's Marketo blog, Best Practices for Lead Source in Your Engagement Platform, lead source is a method by which a prospect found your product or service. I want to be very clear to everybody on the call that many of us may be advanced or intermediate Marketo users. Some of this stuff may be a little bit redundant for those of us who are aware of it, but there may be some people who are net new. So we're just going to kind of run through it all. I'll try to do my best to keep this quick. But again, if there's any questions, please stop me and we'll jump in. But again, lead source is the method by which a prospect found your product or service. What lead source means and the data that's used to determine it also does vary very heavily by company to company, meaning there isn't a set standard in the industry. Really, everybody has their own unique spin on what they like to track and how they like to categorize where people are coming from to understand how people arrive at their website. And again, while these nuances do occur, there are some standard best practices that most companies share. And that's what I'm going to be presenting on today and talking through, as well as some of the pros and cons of the various approaches that companies implement. And again, these best practices for lead source all start with the capture of UTMs. So let's dive into what are UTMs, right? According to Wikipedia, UTM or Urgent Tracking Module parameters are 5 variants of URL parameters used by marketers to track the effectiveness of online marketing campaigns across traffic sources and publishing media, right? That's a little bit of a dense, definition, but really what that translates is there are 5 different parameters that are typically in the URL path that we like to use to track where people are coming from. That first value is the UTM source, which is used to track where the traffic came from, meaning like what site it came from. An example that would be like Google. A UTM medium is used to track the medium used to generate the traffic from the source. So for a Google example, PPC could be a great medium to align with the source of Google. We typically have a UTM campaign URL parameter as well, and this is used to track the specific marketing initiative that drove the traffic. So this is a specific campaign that marketing is running to promote multiple assets maybe, or to generate engagement. And that's where we're going to track that parameter. We also have 2 other additional attributes that are most commonly used for paid ads and are more optional. I typically view the top 3 source, medium, and campaign as required whenever we're sending out URLs externally. But most ad teams that are doing paid media are going to want to use a UTM content and term, the content being what was the content specifically we were promoting, our free trial or white paper B, right? Where the term is typically going to be used to understand what word we were bidding on that ad platform. So maybe we're running a Google PPC ad and the term that we bid against was, Marketo, right? As a word, right? So going into an example of a URL with UTMs, at the top, you can see that I've got this example page URL. And there's some things to note about this URL. All URL parameters always follow a question mark. So you can see highlighted in blue, I've got a question mark, and this tells the internet application that you're using where the domain ends and where the URL parameters begin in the URL path, right? Second to that, URL parameters are always split by an ampersand or whatever, an and sign. And this is used, and they use an equal sign to delineate the URL parameters from the values. So you can see that every different parameter that we're tracking is separated by that purple and sign. And you notice that the URL parameter is in green, where the value we're going to capture for that parameter is shown in yellow, right? I'm calling these URL parameters because these are you're not restricted to only capturing UTMs in a URL path. A great example is the Spotify link that you can see here, where if you share a song from Spotify, you're going to notice that they put a question mark at the end of their URL path. They do an SI equals, and then they have a unique code. I have no idea what this is tracking, but they have some proprietary stuff internally that they want to track for how we share information. Or maybe this is the sharing user ID or something that indicates I'm the one who shared it. I don't really know, but this is just another reminder that you can define your own custom URL parameters, but I would not always encourage it for a marketing purpose. The main reason that most marketers stick to the 5 parameters that we discussed on the previous slide is because Google Analytics will natively track the 5 standard parameters with very little effort on your website. So it really is best to just follow industry best practices and try your best to stick to those UTM source, medium, campaign, content, and term values. Jumping into how UTMs are captured in Marketo, we know that they come in from a URL path. But in Marketo, we can actually capture UTMs in multiple different methods. And I actually think I jumped ahead a slide on accident, or I did these out of order. I actually totally hit a slide or deleted it on accident, which I'm really bummed about. So I'm just going to kind of speak through the different approaches here. On the right-hand side, you're going to notice in the image that on a form, we have the ability to actually hide fields. And so normally what you're going to do is take and create all 5 of your hidden UTM fields in your instance, and then you're going to add them to every form that you want to capture on. Right? Now that they're on your form as hidden fields, we need to determine how the form is going to ingest those records into the system, right? The first primary method is actually the one that I like is cookie values, and that's because we have the ability to control cookies, right? So the pro is that we have the ability to say, I want to pull the UTMs right now and I want to store them, but you get to determine when you want to set them. You also get to determine when you want to clear them. And a good example of why that's beneficial also, we'll talk about in a minute when we go to URL parameters, but something like a URL parameter is going to pull from the URL at the time of form submission, right? And if you think about sending somebody to your page with an ad URL, if they don't convert on that very first page and they go to another page, those UTMs are typically stripped from the URL path. And now you don't know how somebody engaged with that form, right? Because we've lost those UTMs. And that is a benefit of the cookie value capture process is we can store those cookie valued UTMs and we can wait until somebody actually fills a form later on down the road. And then we can take those cookie values and actually pull them in on the form, right? A downside of that approach is that it requires development help to actually implement some script on your website to capture the values from the URL and store them in the cookie. But then we can pull them from the cookie values on the form. This also requires cookie consent, which is changing very rapidly in our ecosystem and landscape, right? I'm sure everybody started to see the banners at the bottom that say, yes, you're giving me permission to track your cookies, right? If users don't enable that, sometimes this functionality doesn't work, which is not ideal. But outside of cookie values, Marketo does capture a refer parameter every time somebody's created in the instance. And this is how did they arrive at our pages from the get-go. Again, this should work on any page with Munchkin script enabled. And Marketo will start to parse those values, and you have the ability to say in the refer parameter, this is the attribute that I want to actually grab from. The negative side to that is that we don't have control over how and where Marketo actually tracks that value. And also the duration of those UTMs and how they're preserved over time is something that's a little bit gray to me and more of a black box than anything. I gleaned the URL parameter approach, which is literally saying it has to be in the URL at the time of form fill, and you can list out what attribute you want to pull them from. And finally, the last one is default parameter, default value. This is where you basically are hard coding a value into the fields, which is not something I'd recommend, only because it requires you to have one form to align to each piece of content you're promoting or each channel you're promoting. And you start to have a lot of form sprawl, where if you really want to manage global forms and reduce the number of forms in your instance, this approach typically doesn't scale very well, right? But as an example, let's pretend that you have a contact us form and you know it's specific to contact us and you want to capture the asset consumed. You could have a hidden field for asset consumed and hard code a value of contact us, right? Because we know the form serves a specific use case. So I know that I accidentally lost that previous slide, which I was very excited about because it listed all these pros and cons very, very beautifully in it. The other ways that you can capture UTMs in your instance are hidden fields. Oh, wait, sorry, on import. Oh, and I literally did this and I forgot I did this. So we just talked through this: cookie values, referring parameters, URL parameters, and again, the pros and cons of all these different approaches. On the right side, you're going to see where in the URL parameter approach, I'm saying I'm pulling from the UTM source value, and you can set a default value, meaning if for some reason there isn't a value in the UTM source, I'm going to actually append one. This is something that I recommend for UTMs because it gives us clarity into having complete data and knowing that somebody submitted a form and there was no value at that time, as opposed to having an empty field, because later on down the road, somebody may fill out another form and we may think that that's the first time that they've interacted with us, when in reality, they already have previously, right? So it's always good to capture values in these fields. Even if you can't pull them from the URL, it's good to have a default value that you know meant there was nothing included. The other ways that you can capture them, like I said, was a default value. You can also do this via importing. So again, for offline events and webinars and things like that, oftentimes you're going to want to manage the import yourself. And again, the benefits of that is that you get to control the values and ensure they're standardized, but it also requires manual effort and it's not run real time, which means most marketers, we want to run forms. The reason it's called a marketing automation tool is because we don't want to have to work every time to get things to run real time. And that's the benefit of an automated fashion approach. So jumping into why to capture UTMs, I think for most people on this call, it may be very relevant, but there's two primary benefits of capturing UTMs. The first benefit is that capturing UTMs gives us the ability to understand what channels are performing best for our company, right? So we can start to report on leads created and where they're coming from. They're coming from Google, they're coming from LinkedIn, they're coming from Facebook, they're coming from these different mediums, PPC or social or email, right? We can start to take that data and we can start to relate it to opportunities generated in our instance. And we can start to say, well, this is where we're getting the most pipeline for our business from, based on where these records are getting created from that are turning into opportunities. And finally, the biggest benefit to capturing UTMs is that it gives you the ability to track return on ad investment. A lot of times your company is going to spend a lot of money on ads, and we want to have the ability to actually track the success of those programs. And so you run campaign A, you can pull a report on everybody that was created with a UTM campaign value that matches your campaign, and boom, you can start to see the success of your program and how it's been running. The second primary benefit of capturing UTMs is they give us the ability to help determine the lead source, which enables our ability to roll up channels into higher level categories that give us insight into our business as a whole. While we may have a bunch of different unique UTM values, they sometimes roll into aggregate categories, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on. In terms of common fields that are used to track UTMs, the last UTM values, which should be included on all forms as hidden attributes, are going to be populated by one of the capture approaches that we talked about before. And those values are, this is our two most preferred field naming convention, because we like to kind of prefix things with the program that's going to be managing the data, followed by the attribute. So this is the last UTM source field. And it's important for us to know that the last is the one that goes on our forms, because we want to always update that every time somebody comes through. And again, it could be pulled from a URL parameter, a cookie value. It could be pulled from a referring parameter. But again, we want the last values to be on our forms. And every time somebody submits a form, they're going to be updated, right? So no field blocking on those forms. The other fields that we use to capture UTMs are going to be first UTM values. And these values should never be changed once set. So again, even though that last value is going to update every time, whenever somebody's created in your instance for the first time, it is typically a best practice to grab those last UTM values and write them to the original or the first UTM values, because that gives us the ability to say, we know that something has changed since then, but I want to know how people were created, and I want to know how they arrived at my site from the very first time, right? And again, these first UTM values are typically appended from the last values whenever somebody is created. So moving on, in terms of lead source, there are some common fields in the industry that people will use to capture lead source. These are the two most values that we like to use internally. While not all companies will leverage a category lead source field, I do very frequently see people managing a lead source and a lead source detail field. Again, these are all last values, which means every time the last values update for UTMs, we're going to want to set the last UTM or the last source values from those last UTM values, right? Just like how we have original UTM fields, we're going to want to also manage some first source values as well. And again, these first values are going to be set from the last source field on person creation, and they should never be changed once set, right? So we're going to have the exact same fields, but we're going to have them listed as first, and we're going to have the category, the source, and the detail. To provide some insight, the category generally for us is inbound versus outbound. So a very high level, it was inbound versus an outbound initiative. The lead source is going to combine that inbound, but it's also going to tell us what type of interaction it was: PPC, social, paid social, organic, direct. And then the lead source detail is a combination of all three of those attributes. So inbound, PPC, Google, right? And now I know that it was an inbound PPC Google ad that sourced this record to kind of aggregate that data together. And having these three attributes, again, gives you the ability to create dashboards based on whatever level you want. So you can see your inbound, outbound mix using category. You can see your high-level channels using the lead source. And then if you really wanted to understand your Google traffic as an example, great, you can use the first lead source detail category to look at inbound PPC Google and how that breaks out. Other common field names for this lead source data include the most recent lead source category, most recent lead source, or most recent lead source detail. So again, instead of last, most recent, right, which sometimes is more intuitive for users. Also on the inverse of that, for the first values, it's also very common to see original lead source category, original lead source, or original lead source detail. Again, all of these fields are optional. Every company has their own version of how they name these. Again, this is just what our preferred approach is at Atumos. There is no right or wrong way to do these, but it is best practice to kind of have last UTM values, first UTM values, the last to populate the first on creation, and then also the exact same thing, last source values that are pulled from the last UTMs, and then first source values that are going to get appended from the last source values on a user creation. So how can we use UTMs to set lead source values? And this is going to be demo time, and I'm very excited to actually kill this demo really quickly. And I'm going to open up an Atumos instance really quick so I can walk you through a program for how I like to manage capturing UTMs and source values in an instance. And so give me 1 second to change my screen. Genesis, you want to give me a thumbs up? Everybody can see my screen? Cool. So this is a program that's called KN Lead Source Executable. And this is one centralized program where we're going to manage all of the values that we just talked about on those previous slides. At a high level, you're going to see that we've got some triggers that are going to initiate the program at the very top. From there, I've got a folder that's going to manage the first UTM fields. I've got another folder that's going to manage the last UTM source fields, or sorry, the last source fields. And then I have a third folder that's going to be managing the first source fields. The reason that they're listed in order is typically I like to take the last UTMs and write them to the first, and that's one of the first things I want to do, right? Second to that, once that's done, I'm then going to write to the last source fields using the last UTM values. And then finally, once that's done and I know that I have a last source values, that's when I'm going to want to go ahead and manage the first source fields and pull those from the last source values, right? So to talk about how we're going to do this, I'm going to actually jump in at the top here and start with the triggers that are going to initiate this program. For those of you that aren't familiar with executable campaigns, this may start to look a little bit unique to you. Executable campaigns came out earlier in 2021, around March or April, I think. And they're very similar to like a campaign is requested, but they give us the ability to ensure that there's a time component focused on this, right? Meaning process A is going to complete before I initiate process B in a flow step. If you have questions about executable campaigns, this is a perfect shameless plug for my skill exchange session on February 8th. I'm explicitly talking about executable campaigns, how they differ from campaign as requested. And I'll talk you through how to identify when to build them and how they enable you to really manage timing conflicts in your instance. But we'll talk through that today as well here too. So talking at the very top, we're going to actually start with the lead source controller on creation, right? Most programs in Marketo need to account for two things, right? Somebody's created, I'm probably going to want to run the program. And then separate to that, something happens after the person's created and we're going to want to run the program again. And I have that broken out into two triggers at the very top here. So the first one is meant to manage records on creation. If I go to the smart list, because this is executable, I cannot have triggers here. I can only have filters. But this is typically going to be initiated by an original processing or a lead is created type program, where that program runs on person is created. It's one trigger in your instance to manage person creation processes. And I'm going to execute this lead source controller from that location, right? But whether you have that program or not, you could always set up a separate trigger that says person is created, and then you could execute this campaign from that person is created campaign that you would create, right? So the flow step side of this is going to do a couple things. the first thing that's going to do is it's going to execute our process to set the first UTM fields, right? If we jump down into this campaign, that means there's no filters on this. And all that we're going to do, like I mentioned, is take the last UTM values that we have, and we're going to write them to the first UTM values that we have, right? So take the last UTM source, write it to the first source. Take the last medium, write it to the first medium. Take the last campaign, last campaign, last term, first campaign. You get the idea, right? You'll notice on the schedule tab, this is set to only run once, and that's because it should never run other than when a person is created, which should only happen one time in your instance, right? If we jump back up to the lead controller at the very top that is running on person creation after I have run this first UTM assignment, which this process will complete because this is executable, it's going to require this process to complete before this campaign proceeds down to the flow action number 2 here. In flow action number 2, I'm then going to say, let's execute the last source controller. And so if I actually open this last source fields program, you're going to notice that I have this last source controller. In here, I have one folder to align to each of the different lead source values that I want to manage in our instance. This is just an example. I have not built out all the source values here. Every company, again, is going to determine what types of source that they want to track. So I would figure out what your UTM strategy is typically step 1 to define. And then from there, that's going to translate directly into what your source values are. But I, at a minimum, like to have at least mediums that are unique for each of these folders, right? Because mediums are typically the primary way that we're going to route people in here. So again, this controller gets executed. And on the flow side of this, you're going to notice that we're evaluating smart list membership. And so at the very top, I'm going to say, if you're a member of my inbound email smart list, then I'm going to execute the inbound email smart campaign. I'm going to jump down here for a PPC example. And in this example, we're down here, you'll see at some point we run this PPC one, which is 215B right here, right? So at some point, we're going to evaluate this smart list. And if they meet the criteria of this smart list, we're going to execute this campaign to actually set the values. And so looking at the smart list, the only thing that actually is in here as criteria is a medium of PPC. And that's because I know anything that's coming in with a UTM medium last value of PPC is going to need to run through this process. Now, the campaign, once it's executed, again, has no smart lists on the front because we don't need those here technically, and less is more in Marketo when we build. I'm then going to go ahead and set the last lead source category to inbound. I'm going to set the last lead source value to inbound PPC. And then I'm actually going to evaluate against that last lead source or the last UTM source value. And if it contains Google, then I'm going to set the value to inbound PPC Google, right? I could add more choices for Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever other platforms you're advertising on. And this is a great way to scale this program without having to create additional campaigns in the left side of the tree, right? If for some reason I don't have a source value that I'm looking for in my instance or accounting from, meaning somebody's messed with the UTMs or something else goes on, it is always great to have a catch-all default value. And in this example, it's just inbound PPC because I don't know where the exact source came from, right? Finally, I'm going to add records to a static list, which lives local to this program as well. This is all preference. You don't have to do this. But again, sometimes it's nice for us to have the ability to go back and audit. Maybe there's some quality assurance alerts we can build off of this. But in this example, again, we're going to run through and set the last source values. So coming back up to the very top of the program again, and I'm going to have to keep moving because I've got more content to cover. We've set the first UTM values. We've set the last source values now because this is executable. And now that I know I have last source values, I can now run the final process down here to manage the first source values using those last source values. And again, there's no filters on the front end of this smart campaign. And in the flow step, I'm going to say, let's take the last lead source category value and let's write it to the first lead source category value. I'm going to take the last lead source value, write it to the person source, which is the out-of-box Marketo field, which I use as the first source field. And then we take that last lead source detail value and write it to the last lead source or the first lead source value. And again, this is set to run only once. Now that we've covered things on creation, we also need to account for things that happen after the fact, right? And that's what this every status trigger at the top is intended to run. This is also going to vary instance to instance. I typically recommend people trying to figure out how people get into their instance to determine what triggers they want to run here, because if you're not careful, this is going to start to run redundantly, and we really want to avoid that. So fills out form is great if you're using Marketo forms. Everything that is not form-based in Marketo, I typically like to use the program status is changed. There may be some unique nuances where you're not setting program membership in your instance on record creation. You could use a static list to trigger this process. And you'll notice the only gate that's on this is to make sure that we've already run our first values. And that's because I don't want this to run on creation. I want to wait for that on creation process to run. And once I have those first values set, great. Now I can listen for later interactions and run this again in the future. Now, where the lead source controller up here ran through all of these process, we don't actually need to manage either of the first processes after the person has been created. And so you'll notice that the flow step side of this lead source controller, all it's going to do is actually execute the last lead source controller, which is here, which is just going to update the last lead source detail values. Okay. That's kind of the end of the demo that I have here today. And so I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pivot back over to the deck that we were presenting. Give me one moment, play from current slide. And boom, here we are. So we just talked through this demo time. So now with all that said, I do want to have a hot take really quickly, right? Lead last values to me in terms of source aren't very valuable. They're not very useful. And that's because they're always constantly changing, which means if you ever try to build dashboards or reports on it, you're literally always looking at a moving target. Some people like to use this to inform sales decisions, but I don't know how knowing somebody came through a Google PPC ad is helpful to sales. Sales typically wants to know, well, what was the content somebody consumed? And I typically prefer to use campaign or program membership or interesting moments to articulate that information. So it's my preference to have sales go and look at that data and when people interacted in the time of those interactions using campaigns or interesting moments more than using the source data. So really in terms of what I feel is valuable, I love the first source values. I don't see a lot of value in the last source values, but there's no harm in appending them and managing them, which a lot of companies like to do. So this gets us into how our channel and offer different, which is a really fun philosophical conversation I like to have. A channel, as I'm referring to it here, is how a person arrived at your site. And these are the actual lead source and the UTMs and all the stuff that we were just showing. It's how did somebody get here, but it's not what they actually engaged with, right? So to understand what somebody engaged with, and again, this is the UTM values we've been discussing, to understand what somebody's engaged with, that's typically the offer. And that is the content or the offer. Maybe it's a free trial or a white paper that the person engaged with. To actually provide you with their data because they did something, and how they got there is important, but we also want to track what they did, right? To do this, we typically use smart Marketo programs, or we use SFDC campaigns, as I mentioned, tomato, but this is really the ebook or the free trial versus the Google inbound, right? Now, what's the difference between lead source and multi-touch attribution? I think the first thing to call out is that lead source informs the channel of acquisition, right? This is how I acquired new names in my instance, right? And maybe this is the last channel somebody came through and interacted with in our instance, right? Multi-touch attribution is a little different because multi-touch attribution is a company's efforts to understand all the interactions a person has taken and typically connecting that with the channel and the offer. So now I know they did a free trial. How did they get there? And I'm going to talk to you about a couple ways that you can track this. This is also more accomplished when people start to overlay the interaction somebody has had across their customer or lead lifecycle, because that starts to give us clarity into the velocity of where people are moving and also which types of interactions are actually moving people through our funnel the fastest, right? Meaning people always MQ off of our trial and those records are converting at a really high rate to opportunities. Great, let's start to push our free trial, which is a very easy win, but maybe you can inform some of those decisions with other places in your instance or other assets. So let's talk about how I can capture data to understand channels used to engage with offers. And I'm going to talk about two different ways that I've seen people implement this to try to understand this. The first part is called a parent-child campaign or channel campaign structure. And on the left-hand side, you're going to see that I have a parent asset campaign for free trial K. And underneath that parent SFDC campaign, I'm going to have trial or like a child campaigns. One for PPC Google, one for PPC LinkedIn, one for social, one for email, one for organic, right? While people are processed into your free trial program, typically you're going to use those last UTM values and you're going to say, okay, I know this is the source is Google, let's put them in the Google campaign versus, okay, I know the source is LinkedIn and the medium is LinkedIn, well, let's put them into the LinkedIn campaign, right? And this goes on and on and on, put them into different campaigns, right? Typically, this is managed in a decentralized fashion, like I said, local to the program in free trial K. And some of the negatives or downsides to this is that if you ever wanted to change your UTM values or your structure, if it's decentralized, it may require a lot of work, right? You may want to have a new value included. And now you need to go through every program and update what you're looking for to route people into these programs, which sometimes doesn't scale, right? It also requires the creation of new campaigns every time that you're going to want to promote a new channel, which sometimes can be labor intensive. And it also can be limited because let's pretend you don't want to just report on channel. Now you don't have really a good campaign structure to report on anything else, like maybe the UTM campaign and how you drove them there. Another approach to this that I really prefer and that I've seen a lot of marketers implement is called a canonical content type approach. This would be having one program in your instance to manage free trial K. So it's one program and one Marketo SFDC campaign. And on that SFDC campaign, or in Marketo with custom program member fields, we're going to create custom fields to capture UTMs at the time of interaction, right? And so really what that looks like is members are all added to the same campaign, and using either a process builder or Marketo flow steps, depending on where you want to track this, we're going to take those last UTM values and we're going to write them to custom campaign fields to say, I know that you've downloaded free trial K, and the way that you got there was from this source, medium, campaign, term, content, right? And using campaign member reporting or using Marketo custom fields reporting, which is very limited, to be honest, right now, we then have the ability to start to find trends of, I can report on everybody who's come in via social, and I can look at the campaigns that they've interacted with, right? Or I can look at one single campaign and I can start to see all of the other types of channels that they're using to interact with that the most, right? So I can look at my trial and say people are interacting with it the most from Google, or they're interacting with it the most from PPC or email, right? This is typically my preferred approach because there's less effort to build new campaigns. You only need to build one. And you also can easily change your approach later on down the road because all you do is update your UTM strategy and boom, you're already capturing the data accurately and you can report on it however you'd like moving forward, right? There's also, it says no insight into multiple interactions. This is actually a negative component to a canonical content approach. And that's because you can typically only be a campaign member or a program member one time in Marketo. Right. And so we're on the left-hand side, we've got 10 different types of interactions to track a campaign member for a trial. If somebody came in on Google and they came in on an email, now I have 2 campaign member responses, and I know that 2 different times that somebody interacted with us, right? Versus if you take the canonical content approach, I can only really track the first time that they ever interacted with one piece of content, right? So that's a negative approach to the canonical content approach, but every business needs to determine what's viable to them. Some companies will try to get around this by doing like annual or quarterly programs, which is very labor intensive, and maybe gives you the ability to track that, but you're still only bound to that time frame. Meaning if I interacted with the same thing twice in a year, you still only can track the first time, right? Unless I've interacted with it 1 year and then the second year. So how do I report on this stuff? And this is going to be a question or an answer everybody hates. This all depends on the approach that you take to implement and manage your UTMs and your sources, right? There are benefits to multiple campaigns to track channels, right? Because we can track multiple interactions, like I just mentioned. Content syndication is a perfect example where sometimes a marketing manager is running a program and they just want to see one campaign with all their people in it, right? They don't want to have to go create an SFDC report and report on, CS as a medium for a campaign custom field, and then the campaign that they ran with the vendor or the vendor name, right? Sometimes that's tedious, but that data is accessible. They often just lack the knowledge to understand how to get that information out of it, right? But there are also channel limitations to the parent structure approach. We just talked about all of those in the other example, which is it's a little bit more burdensome. You have to kind of manage it decentralized, which isn't always great. There's also source of truth limitations to the approach above with the parent asset model. And that's because if you ever wanted to run exclusions in Marketo, meaning we wanted to send an email only to people who haven't consumed this content, you then need to kind of list and outline 8 different programs or campaigns to kind of aggregate everybody together who's engaged with the same asset, as opposed to having just one program as your source of truth, right? So how do I decide my approach? I always recommend thinking first to determine the tool that you're going to be doing your reporting out of, because that definitely matters. And if it's just SFDC, that can have its limitations, right? If it's Tableau or Domo or something else, some other BI tool, that's going to give you a lot more flexibility. And maybe you can take a more advanced approach depending on what type of tool you have. You need to weigh the pros and cons also of each approach based on the reporting sophistication and your company's needs, right? If you don't have a strong analytics person, maybe take an initial campaign type approach, like I mentioned, the parent-child one, versus if you do have somebody that's good in analytics and can help those managers, maybe take the canonical content approach, right? At the end of the day, you always need to start somewhere, and you need to figure out how it's limiting you and then figure out what you want to do and whether it's worth value to change it. So there's no wrong answer here. It's really just start somewhere, draw a line in the sand, start to track what's going on, and you can always change it later on down the road. Nothing's set in stone. So with that, I'm going to pause really quickly. I know that we're at the 45-minute mark and we're getting closer towards the end of our meeting, but I would love to field any questions that people have right now for about 5 minutes before we jump into the other later mug topics that we have. So feel free to take yourselves on mute, throw stuff in the chat, but does anybody have any questions on what I presented? Silence, pure silence.
I'll just jump in and say, I'll just jump in and say super cool. Thanks so much for sharing all this.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, I was trying to speak earlier. Thank you so much for that information. There was a lot of helpful stuff in there and summarized really, really well. My question for you was, I agree. I typically don't like the last values for all the different lead source programs. However, for GDPR, one of the things we capture is that source detail of which Marketo program they gave us consent on. So I pull that out of the most recent lead source detail field. So I'm curious, if you're not a big fan of that, do you have another approach for how you capture that for legal purposes, or is that just not something you've seen other legal teams advise you capture?
Yeah, I wish Marketo had like a most recent program engaged with type field, and they don't
Right.
really, right? And you could create that field and you can actually set up a program status is changed trigger. And in the flow step, you can use a token value for the campaign trigger, which would actually append the program name that triggered the person into the program. So you do have the ability to kind of set and manage a last program engaged with field in the instance. Another way around that is oftentimes using interesting moments, right? Because if you're running interesting moments well, you're going to have captured a web interaction with your free trial at the time that they process through that program, right? So keep in mind, you do have that last interesting moment field, which gets set natively by Marketo in your instance. So that's another tool you could use. But if you did implement either of those approaches in your GDPR consent, you could pull from either the last interesting moment value that aggregates that data together. You could also pull from the most recent campaign, and you also have the ability to pull from the most recent or the last source, the UTM values themselves, right? Sometimes for compliance, we don't really need like the clean, friendly version of where we captured consent. We can literally say it was Google, whatever, right? And so every company has their own version of how they like to do that and capture consent, but those are a couple different options that I would present to you for ways you could do that.
Interesting. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no worries. I love compliance too. I get to talk about it all the time. And so that's a whole nother fun thing. And I hope, by the way, on that topic, that everybody's using a text field to capture their consent history. I really recommend against a date time field, because somebody could opt in today, they could unsubscribe a month from now, and they could opt back in a year from now. And if you've sent them emails during a time they're complaining about, you start to lose visibility into when you captured that consent. So a text field that just concatenates what type of consent we gained or lost, where it was done, that gets concatenated over time, is a really great approach to solving consent history over time. That's a totally separate topic, but food for thought. Any other questions on lead source, UTM capture, attribution, different ways that companies are solving for this? And I guess this is also open feedback sharing. You know, if anybody has a different approach they like to use, I would love to hear about it. Just for the fun of discussion. Cool. Well, with that, I think that we'll probably wrap up the questions portion of this. If anybody has any questions, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, connect with Genesis as well. We'd love the network. And I'm always more than happy to address any questions that you have offline. So please don't hesitate to seek me out. Jumping through the rest of this meeting, going into job seeking and hiring. I'm going to kind of share my screen here and we can talk about it. But is anybody actively pursuing opportunities that's in the crowd today? And if so, take yourself off mute and give us a little about yourself if you are. I love the silence because it means everybody's gainfully employed, which makes me very, very happy. And I know the market's very hot. So if you want a job, odds are you can find it. But if you're struggling, please do, again, reach out to myself, Genesis, let us know. And we're happy to help try to connect you with networks to figure out where you can get an opportunity. On the flip side of that, is anybody on the call hiring actively for a role that they're interested in trying to find talent for?
So our role's not quite posted yet, but we have a marketing analysis role coming soon. So ideally, it's somebody with some good Marketo history, as well as some good Google Analytics history, to really help us just wrangle all of our different data sources and get that reporting into a good place. So I'll be posting the link to that job in the Marketing Ops Slack channel as soon as it's live, but that one's coming soon if anybody out there loves data and reporting.
That's awesome. And Carly, what company are you working for?
Yes, we are with Greenhouse Software. So we're all about making hiring efficient, scalable, and diverse.
Thank you for sharing. Anybody else actively hiring for a role right now that they'd like to share? I will take that as a no, but if you do have a role you're trying to hire for, feel free to take yourself off mute and let me know. With that, I always love tech stack discussions. Anybody been playing with fun tools that they have a hot take on, either positive or negative in the industry?
Actually, hey, it's Carly again. We use
How it should.
we use a tool called Asana for project management. And what my actual campaign ops manager is not on this call did is she connected it to a Wufoo form. So now anytime somebody needs our support, they start in that form. It automatically kicks off an Asana card for us to take, where then we can build out all the different marketing operation steps that might be required. But then she gave us some custom fields on those cards for the different pillars of marketing ops and which team it supports. So now we have this beautiful dashboard that is showing how we're supporting the marketing team across the different pillars of marketing ops and how much is going on all at once. And then we have a special section where we can add stuff upcoming with our rough timelines. And it's really changing how we can plan out our year and actually provide like really good estimates back to the team members of how long we think it'll take us to do it. Because for the first time, we have visibility into everything the team is touching at once. And it's awesome. I love it. I feel like she finally cracked the code that all previous teams I've been on have been trying to hack from a marketing ops standpoint of like, how do you explain everything we do? So I'm like super, super pumped on it and totally now recommend Asana.
I love that approach, and having a good campaign or program submission process that's defined that can track into a project management tool like Asana or Monday or Jira or any of those tools is really a fantastic approach that I've seen work very well for some of my clients. So thank you so much for sharing that, Carly, because I do think that this is one of those things a lot of teams overlook that really can streamline their processes and help them prioritize tasks. And remind people, if you want stuff done, you got to submit it, and we need to be able to track it, and then we can start to prioritize it relative to other initiatives and timing. So it's a really great call out. Any other fun tools people have been playing with? Cool. Well, there's nothing else in particular. I just want to say thank you on behalf of Genesis and myself for attending today's Marketo user group. I know that we really enjoyed the engagement and participation and everybody coming to join. So thank you. Thank you. I'll now open it up. I know we've got 8 minutes left. I do have to run at the top of the hour, but would love to open it up to any other questions people have, problems that they're trying to solve, networking they'd like to do. But if you got a drop, go for it. Otherwise, hang out and let's talk some problems if anybody has any. No bad questions. This is a safe space.
I guess I'll just keep going since I'm in a talkative mood today.
Hell yeah, Carly.
I am implementing Cvent's integration with Marketo for the first time ever. So if anybody has any OMG, don't do this, or things to avoid, I'm mainly depending on what I read on the internet and advice straight from Cvent themselves. But I've been burned by vendors before who sometimes just give really, really bad advice. So if anybody has anything, I am all ears.
On the call, ever worked with Cvent specifically?
I had experience with implementing Cvent with Pardot. So the one caveat that I had with that one is it created programs automatically by default. So it started messing things up and we didn't catch it until afterwards. So I'm not quite sure if the integration with Marketo is the same way.
Oh no, Genesis, I can only imagine being like, where did these come from?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't worked with Cvent specifically, but some event platforms that integrate with Marketo will automatically create programs like Genesis mentioned. If they don't, you typically need to connect the Marketo program to the event manually, which happens after you create the event, just like you would with like GoToWebinar or On24, any of those platforms. And most frequently via the API, they're just passing program membership and user data on registration. So that means if you're using a Marketo form to capture program membership in Marketo, that setting of a program status that's linked with your Cvent event is going to automatically register that person in Cvent, or vice versa. If you're using a Cvent form to capture the information, those registrant data is going to pull in from Cvent, and it's going to automatically push it into Marketo with the appropriate status to align with whatever Cvent shows. So typically they run bidirectionally. Oftentimes they don't create programs, but they sometimes do. It just kind of depends on the integration. I'm sure you have, but the integration documentation is always critical first place to start, just to figure out how to set up the integration and nuances of the integration. The vendor team should be helpful, and I understand how you've gotten burned because I have too before. But I'd always just say run a pilot. That's like the biggest recommendation I have is it never hurts to run a mock event prior to one that actually matters. So play with it and just test it and do a registration on both sides, see what happens just to confirm the behavior that you're expecting.
Great advice. Thank you.
Any other questions that people have or problems that they're actively working to try to troubleshoot or solve? Anybody got any fun weekend plans? I mean, this is open networking time. These were so fun when they were in person because you just got to walk up to people and start, put them in the hot seat. Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, I think that we'll probably just call it a wrap 5 minutes early. But thank you again to everybody for your time today. Feel free to connect with Genesis and I on LinkedIn. We'd love to continue the conversation, and looking forward to the next San Diego Marketo user group meeting, which we don't have scheduled yet, but are excited to get scheduled. And if you have any ideas, feel free to shoot them to us in Slack or LinkedIn. All those things we can talk about, whatever. Nothing's off limits.
What was the February 8th skill exchange event you had spoken about?
Yeah, let's run back to that really quickly. So Marketo does, and this is fun because we're going way back in the way back time machine. But the skill exchange is an event that Marketo has started to put on that is specific to knowledge sharing and information. And so there's going to be, it's a 3-hour event. All the different people that are on the right are going to be talking about multiple different areas of expertise. The section that I'm a part of is specific to tips and tricks or new features and functionality. And so my topic is only going to be a 15-minute presentation. And there's 3 other people that are doing 15-minute presentations. And then we're all going to be on a panel so that we can talk and answer questions or just chat about other general things after the fact. But there are other product subject matter experts from the Marketo team that are going to be talking about product and features. I know that there's a new release that just came out, I believe this week, actually, the January release, and there's some cool things related to like form validation rules. So I'm certain that they'll cover some of those topics. But yeah, it's really just a knowledge share event, very similar to a mug, but a little bit more in presentation format where they're formalized presentations, and then more of like a QA in chat versus these mugs where we just get to talk and ask questions, So a little bit different.
Oh, sounds awesome. Thanks.
But it is a free, fully virtual event. You can register and attend. We'd love to have as many people join as possible.
Great. Yeah, we'll do.
I have not been looking at the chat whatsoever. I didn't see if anything else is here. Cool. Well, yeah, just want to thank everybody again for their time and for joining the SD Mug. Genesis, thank you. You kicked ass in your very first Mug meeting, so kudos to you. And either way, we'll look forward to seeing everybody next time. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.